quality time this morning. I had a friend growing up, and by the time I knew him, his parents had been married for a long time. About the last 10 years before this happened, every Friday the husband would stop on his way home from work, local flower shop, and he would buy a bouquet of flowers. And not the most extravagant, expensive ones. It was like $10 every Friday, and he'd bring them home and present them to his wife, and his wife would say thank you. And there were always a vase full of fresh flowers in that house, no matter when you went to that house. And she sort of nurtured those flowers from one Friday to the next. 10 years later, brings flowers home, presents them to her. She says thank you, and she says, you know, I love the flowers, but what I would really love is if next Saturday we carved out some time in the morning and you helped me sort of change this area of the backyard, and we just made a flower garden. To which he thought, he didn't say, 10 years ago you couldn't have told me this, right? Like how much time and how much money have I spent buying you flowers every Friday at the end of the work week? And only now, 10 years later, you say, well, what I would really like is this. So the next Saturday, they spend the day together, and there's a huge plot of a huge flower garden that is created. And then every Friday from then on, what they did was they sat on this bench by the flower garden for about 30 minutes every Friday afternoon, enjoying some quality time and enjoying the flowers. Now there was not just fresh flowers in one part of this house all week. There was a little vase with flowers in almost every room. She didn't want the flowers. Finally, she had figured out that what she needed to communicate is what would make her feel most loved, and that was the time spent. Not the gift or the thought behind the gift, but it was the time that her husband would spend. So this morning we're talking about quality time. For whom is that your love language? Anybody in the room? All right. If you haven't already, there's a place in the bulletin. It shows the website for the love languages. You can go there 10, 15 minutes. You take the survey. It'll spit out the response of what your love language is. It'll make this more fun for you, also deeper learning for you as we walk through this together. The reason we're doing this, of course, is because we believe the Bible when the Bible says that we are supposed to love God, that we are to love God, self, and neighbor. Right? And what we believe is that if we increase our love for any three of those, that our love and our capacity to love the other increases. If we increase our love for God, then our capacity to love ourselves and others will increase. If we increase our love of others, it will increase our capacity to love God and to love others, or to love ourselves. And so in this sermon series, in these post-resurrection days this year, we are thinking about ways in which we can grow our capacity to love others, trusting that when we do that, that we will also grow our capacity to love God. And isn't that why we are here? To grow our capacity to love God. All right? So the word of the day is incarnation. Say that, incarnation. All right, let's say it this time like you're awake. All right, ready? Incarnation. All right, that's better. All right, we're not talking about flowers. All right, not carnation. All right, incarnation. Becoming the very presence of God. Jesus becomes incarnate, becomes the very presence of God here on earth. He embodies the divine. When we think about, in a spiritual sense, quality time, being present with other people, we cannot help as Christians but to think about and to reflect upon the incarnational nature of Jesus. God in the flesh, God with us, embodied the divine here on earth. I love this Emmaus passage. It's one of my favorites. And it's one of my favorites, I think, because I see some of myself, I see some of us, I see some of the church in this passage. I mean, here are some of the disciples who presumably were closest to Jesus, and they're having this conversation with Jesus, and they don't recognize him. How many times is it in life that we don't realize that God is right here with us, right? So I see myself in that. I also see myself in, they're a little bit confused. Did you hear what they say to this person who is Jesus, but they don't recognize him yet? We thought he was going to be the one to redeem Israel. We thought he was. Right? That they're confused about who he was. Not only do they not recognize him, but now they're confused about who he was. We thought he was going to be the one. But then he died. And it was over. Now, yeah, some of our friends said that he came back, but we don't even know what to do with that. So they're on a journey to Emmaus, and where do they end up? It's 7 miles. They end up at home. Now, if all the disciples were huddling together trying to figure out what's next, and they had to walk 7 miles to sleep for the night, and then turn around and walk 7 miles the next day, they're not going home to sleep for the night. I suspect that perhaps they're going home because they think this Jesus thing is over. That this part of their lives, they've given 3 years or however many years they followed, and it didn't happen the way they expected it to, and now he's gone. So I guess we'll just go home and begin living life like we did before he came. And it's on that journey that their eyes are opened. And it's finally when they get to their house and he breaks the bread and has this communion-style meal with them that they discover who. It's in that quality time that he spends with them that day that they come to understand and to believe and to see and to know the presence of God. One of the great arcs of the biblical narrative is about the presence of God. One of the great sort of meta-narratives, the large stories of the biblical story is about the presence of God. And let me just map out that arc for us real quickly so that you can understand what a change that is happening in the biblical narrative and in the whole story of God upon Jesus' resurrection and the first generation of Christians. So originally when the Bible begins, they believe, when the story begins, they believe, and I'm not saying that God has changed throughout the years, but the way in which people believed God or the way that they conceived of God has changed. At the beginning of the biblical story, they believe that God is up there in heaven somewhere, that's where God lives. And that occasionally God might speak to us. Elijah hears a small, still voice of God. Occasionally God might come down and visit us. Adam and Eve hear God walking in the garden. Moses sees the backside of God. And oftentimes the stories in the Old Testament are up on a mountain, like Moses goes up on the mountain to hear from God, to get the 10 Commandments, because the highest mountain was as close as you could come to God, who of course lived in the heavens. So that was their conception of God is up there, occasionally visits down here. Then the people, after being enslaved in Egypt, they're wandering nomadic in the desert for 40 years. And while they're in the desert, they sort of build like this community. They all live in these tents, and every day you roll up your tent and go to the next place, or maybe it's a week or a month later and you move to the next place. And eventually the people say, well, we all have tents. Don't we need a tent for God? And so they make a big tent, and they call it the tent of meeting. And they make this sort of ornate kind of box thing that they believe contains the presence of God. And God speaks to them, and God says, you'll always know that I'm with you, because over this tent during the day, I'm going to put a pillar of clouds, and by night, it'll be a pillar of fire. So no matter where you are in the village, whether you're in this tent or your own tent, you can always look in this direction, and you'll know that I am with you, the presence of God. And somehow, so now God wasn't up in the heavens, but God was somehow in this tent that got rolled up and stuck on a camel, moved to the next point, and then they unrolled it, and there was God again. Then they enter the promised land, and they build all of their homes and the castles, and the king has his castle and his weekend castle and the beach castle and the mountain castle. And then they realize, we haven't built anything for God yet. So they build the temple, then they start looking for this ornate box that they believe contains the presence of God, and they can't find it. They realize, we left it in the desert. We left God in the desert. And so they go back into the desert, and they bring this box that they believe contains the presence of God back with them, and they place it in the temple. In the far recesses in the temple, behind a curtain, that is where the presence of God is for these people. Now, we think of this very differently than they do, and I don't share this so that we can devalue their faith or the way that they understood God, but they understood that it's in this holy, this sacred place that God is with us, and they felt whole and right when they were there. That's a good thing. And then towards the end of the Old Testament, what you see is that the people are angry at God, and God is angry at the people. And in Ezekiel, what happens is that the presence of God leaves that place in the back of the temple, and the presence of God goes and rests outside on the peak of the temple. And then the presence of God leaves, gone. Until the baptism of Jesus. And at the baptism of Jesus, the gospel says what? The heavens opened, and what came out of the heavens, right? The Spirit of God comes and it alights on Jesus. It's not in a building anymore. It's not in a tent. It's not up on a mountain. It's not in some ornate box. It is now in Jesus. And Jesus turns and begins to baptize more people, and they say he doesn't baptize just with water. He baptizes with the Spirit, right? That he begins to give a piece of this Spirit off to others. And eventually the first generation of Christians begin to say things like, where 2 or 3 are gathered, that the Spirit of God somehow becomes in the followers of Christ. That's where God lives. And so when they show up, they bring the Spirit. When we show up, we bring the Spirit of God along. One of the educational pieces that many seminarians in our denomination take part in is what's called clinical pastoral education. And essentially what you do is one of your summers during seminary, you go and you work in a hospital as a chaplain for 10 weeks full time. And we always joke that this was the class that people had to take when they were young, sort of going through seminary, and they had no life experience. So it's like, this is the 24-year-old I know nothing in life class, right? And you're gonna pastor a church here in the next year, but yet you're 23, 24 years old. You have no life experience at all. So what they do is they stick us in this hospital where we're life and death issues every single day. And we would joke that this was the 24-year-old I know nothing in life class. 10 weeks. So I went and did this. Thank God the first day was orientation. We didn't have to see any patients. Day 2, we show up at the hospital. So it's like you and the other students. There's, 7 or 8 students and a supervisor. Every morning you meet together and you pray and you sort of talk about the day. And we're doing that the second day. And the phone in the supervisor's office rings, and she says, I'll send the intern right up. And she looks at me, she says, Brian, you're up. And I had been assigned to the trauma ICU. I looked at the supervisor like, you understand I'm 24 and know nothing, right? So she says, I'll send the intern right up. And she looks at me, she goes, all right, you bed, whatever. And I get up, like no one else is getting up. Like, who's going with me? And she opens the door. And she's not going with me. And I gave her the look again, like, I'm 24 and know nothing. You understand this, right? So I go to the bed, and here's this young guy, younger than me, and he was very sick. And the nurse comes over and explains that he's been in this terrible accident and that he's never going to be, no brain activity, and his parents are just completely distraught. And I said, well, where's the parents? She said, well, we told them that the chaplain was coming, and so they're in the room over there. And I look at her like, I'm 24 and know nothing, right? You understand this, right? And she like walks me over, and then she opens the door, then she closes it. And she's not in the room. And here's Mom and Dad. I introduce myself as the chaplain intern, and both of them, like just immediately, it's like a group hug. And they're sobbing uncontrollably. About a minute later, each of them take my hand and sort of pull me down. And so now we're sitting on a couch. Mom on one side, Dad on the other side, me in the middle. I open my mouth to say something and nothing comes out. And we would sit there and Dad would cry uncontrollably and Mom would talk. And then they'd switch and Mom would cry uncontrollably and Dad would, and every time I opened my mouth, I would be, nothing came out. About 30 minutes later, Mom says, well, we need to thank you so much for coming. We need to go back in and see our son. They got up and left, and I just sat there silent on that couch. I went back to my supervisor's office, and I said, I'm not going to survive this. I can't do this. I didn't even say anything. I didn't even know what to say. I said, it'll be okay. Later that afternoon, she visited with that child and the family. And then at the end of the day, all the students meet back together, and she shared with me that the family was so thankful. They said it was so helpful, the visit that the chaplain made to us. Talking about me. Right? Have you ever been in that place in life where words just don't mean anything? Right? Have you ever been the one that had to provide it, and you're sitting next to that loved one, and everything that comes to your mind, you just think, oh, I can't say that. No, I can't say that. Like nothing, right? Nothing that you can think of would actually make a difference. And so you just sit there in silence. Have you ever been on the flip side of that, where you were the one who was going through the trauma and someone else was sitting with you? Have you ever been in that situation when someone else was sitting with you, and when they thought of something, they just said it? And they said all these things, and all that you could think of is, I just wish they would be quiet. Right? Because nothing that anyone could say right now could. Right? But then there were other people who you knew they didn't have to say anything. They were just there. And that's what mattered. Where 2 or 3 are gathered. See, as Christians, we don't talk about loving people in this quality time kind of way because we're nice to them or because we want to be good friends to them. We understand that as Christians, when we talk about quality time, there's an incarnational nature to our lives, that we become where 2 or 3 are gathered. We bring the presence of Christ into their lives. As C.S. Lewis said, we become little Christ. And in those moments, sometimes we don't have to say a word. In fact, one of the things I learned in those 10 weeks as a chaplain, it was better not to say anything. And just allow the presence of God to be felt through your life. As we think about this and we think about the place that our denomination is in and sort of the flex and the uncertainty of our denomination, I so hope that whatever we become as a denomination, that it understands this dynamic about where 2 or 3 are gathered. You know, as United Methodists, so in the next worship service this morning, we'll baptize. We will have the opportunity to baptize 2 teenage girls, and they'll be asked in that baptism ceremony, will you support this church with your prayers, presence, gifts, service, and witness? Prayers, presence, gifts, service, and witness. That's the vow that we take as Methodists. Presence. We're not talking about presence like gifts under a tree. Presence, where you show up. It matters where we show up. And it doesn't matter most where we show up, because if we don't show up, then we don't get the learning or we don't get the growth. It matters where we show up because we are the presence of God for one another. And so if you refuse to show up, then your brother or sister in Christ is missing out on the presence of God that you bring into their lives. You with me? And this is what we're going to try to convince these girls of today at baptism, that it matters where they show up. And it matters because we believe in an incarnational God. Now, back in the day when the presence of God was behind the curtain in the temple, there were guards who stood outside, and guards stood outside that temple, and they made sure that certain people didn't get in. And they made sure that the right people got in and the wrong people didn't get in. And what that meant is that more and more people found themselves wandering around in life, wondering about the presence of God. And as we think about the next kind of denomination that we will become, I hope that we would say that kind of life is simply unacceptable. To ever leave anybody wandering around in life, wondering about the presence of God. The reason that decision was made is because people were fearful that if all those people got in, that they would spoil the purity of God. That was the fear. The truth is that by denying entrance to anybody, all we do is we belittle the power of God. The Greek word for church, where church comes from, is ecclesia. And ecclesia is the root of two words. The beginning of that word means out of. And the end of that word means to be called. So in the very beginning, this word that meant to be called out of is somehow the way in which they began to conceive of the church. Not to be called into a place like this, but to be called out of into the world. Because the way spiritual life is supposed to work is that we come here that we might soak in the power of God. And then we leave this place and we go there that we might share the power of God's presence with the world. So as you go this week and as you leave this place, not to be nice, not to be a good friend, not to be a loving spouse, do we share that quality time? To share the power of God's presence is what we are called out to do. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.